Hi folks, this is Simon Turpin of Answers in Genesis UK, and you're going to join us this evening, at least in the UK, for my conversation with Dr. Calvin Beisner. Climate change, why should we be concerned? Should we be concerned about this issue as Christians? Now, just to let you know that I had COVID last week and a bit of the week before, so I'm sounding a bit full of cold at the moment, so hopefully we can just get past that. But we're very much looking forward to our interview tonight with Dr. Calvin Beisner. And just before we start our interview, just if you are there in the comment section, please do let us know where you're listening or watching from tonight. Where it doesn't matter where you are in the world, please do just let us know. I just want to tell you about a few resources that our guest has published tonight. I don't have a chance to mention, or he's the author of many books, but one that we do at the ministry specifically is this one, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice. Now, we're not going to be talking about this tonight, sadly, but if you want to know more about this issue that is very much a topic today, then please do check out the link below and you can buy that online. Dr. Beisner has also written an article on environmentalism in the New Answers Book 4, and there's another article in this book by Dr. Alan White on climate change. So if you're interested in digging deeper into these issues, then I would recommend the New Answers Book 4. But my guest tonight is Dr. Calvin Beisner. Dr. Beisner is the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance, the Stewardship of Creation. So I'm going to welcome my guest on right now. Dr. Beisner, good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you again.
Great. Yeah, you were with us when we were originally in lockdown, and we remember some of those interviews fondly. For people who may not be aware of Cornwall Alliance, your own background, could you just give people a brief testimony why you got into this whole issue of stewardship for creation?
Yeah, glad to do that. It could be a very long answer, but I'll try to keep it very short. Actually, from my toddlerhood in Calcutta, India, two things remained very, very important to my memory. One was the beauty of God's creation because of actually just one tree with a beautiful vine with red flowers hanging from it in the courtyard of the apartment building in which we lived. My father was with the US State Department. The other was the horrors of poverty, because for about 6 months, my mother was paralyzed. And so I had to be escorted every morning very early to an Indian home by my ayah or nurse. And all along the way, I would step over the bodies of people who had died overnight of starvation and disease. And those two things just created pictures that have stayed in my mind ever since, over the 64, 63 years or so since then. And later, when I became a Christian, and then began to study the scriptures and to learn from them, both about the way creation declares the glory of God and how God has given humanity a mandate in Genesis 1:28 to steward this creation, to exercise dominion over it, but it should be a godly dominion, not rapacious. I saw there that this beauty of creation that I had encountered as a very little boy was something that should motivate me to want to seek to enhance that, not just to preserve it, but actually to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, the safety of the natural world around us. But the other issue of poverty, as I studied what the Bible taught about the need for Christians to take care of the poor, to protect them from oppression, to help to shape legal and cultural structures that allow them to climb out of poverty. As I studied economics, for example, did my master's in economic ethics and wrote extensively on that. I realized too that God's having given me that experience as a little boy of seeing extreme poverty right up close. Uh, those two things helped to motivate me to want to spend a great deal of my life serving both of those concerns. One, what I call biblical earth stewardship, that is, working together with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and even beyond that, with others, to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, the safety of the earth, to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors, so that we're addressing the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. And then at the same time, seeking to promote those economic structures, those legal structures like private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law, plus especially access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, without which you can't do any work. Energy is necessary for everything that we do, producing food, clothing, shelter, transportation, medical care, everything, right? Uh, I began to realize that we had to wed these things together. We had to weave them together. And eventually that led to the founding of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation in 2005.
Yeah. And so obviously your time in India very much influenced you to move into this stewardship for creation. And I guess when we think about India, I remember I spent 3 months in India and saw the vast amount of poverty, but obviously that comes out of their, would you say it comes out of their religious background by and large because of the
Oh,
way?
absolutely. Absolutely. And this was something that has been clear for a very, very long time. One of the most famous and important missionaries to India in the early 20th century was E. Stanley Jones. And in his books, The Christ of the Indian Road, and now I forget the other title, but he talked about how when people in the West say India needs, food, it needs medicine, it needs this, that, or another thing because it's so poor, he said, what India really needs is Christ.
Yeah.
Because when they get Christ, all sorts of things about their worldview that prevent the creation of wealth and the good stewardship of wealth will get set aside. And that's clearly been the case. A good friend of mine, Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi, is an Indian Christian philosopher. And in his book, India, the Grand Experiment, he actually argued, and of course this is not politically correct by any means, but Vishal argued that the only things about Indian culture, aside perhaps from delicious Indian food, which is my favorite kind of food in the world, that are really worth preserving are the things that Christian missionaries brought during the several centuries of British colonial rule there. That's what ended, temple prostitution, which continued right up to the late 19th century. That's what ended the caste system, at least legally anyway. That's what has ended sati, widows being burned on the funeral pyres along with their dead husbands, all sorts of different things that have been changed because of the influence of Christianity there. And of course, the fact that the Indian government now is so dominated by Hindutva and the radical desire to push out Christians from India is not good news for India's economic well-being over the long haul.
So when we think about this issue, Dr. Beisner, of climate change, can you just give our watching audience some biblical reasons why we should be concerned about this? Because people might be thinking, well, why should I be concerned about climate change? Isn't that just a scientific issue? The Bible doesn't maybe speak about it. Does it speak about it? And how should we be concerned as Christians?
Yeah, I think the scriptures do speak to this issue, not in highly technical scientific terms by any means. That's not the purpose of the scriptures, but they do give us some I think very useful basic principles to lay down. For example, in Genesis 1:31, having created everything, God saw it all, and behold, it was very good. Now, one of my board members, Dr. Roy W. Spencer, who's principal research scientist at the University of Alabama in Huntsville on climatology, one of the world's top climate scientists, was meditating on that verse, 20 some years ago, 25 years ago. And he got to thinking about how climate models are designed on the assumption that adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is going to cause rather large changes in global average temperature because CO2 is what's called an infrared absorbing gas, or some people will call it a greenhouse gas, and that could really do huge harm, even though the amount of CO2 added to the atmosphere by comparison with the entire atmosphere is rather minute, to say the least. I mean, we've gone from prior to the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century to today, we've gone from about 280 parts per million to about 420. But that's parts per million. We're now at about 42 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. Well, he realized the idea that minute change in atmospheric chemistry would cause catastrophic changes to the whole climate system was really difficult to reconcile with, behold, it was very good. What intelligent architect would design a building so that if I leaned on one wall, all of the stress that I put on that wall through my body weight would be multiplied again and again and again by various positive feedback mechanisms till the whole building collapsed? I don't think we'd say that was good design. I don't think we would honor and revere the architect. Well, similarly, if increasing CO2 from 28 thousandths of 1% to 42 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere is going to cause catastrophic climate change, that's not very consistent with this understanding. We also have, God's statement to himself, actually, in Genesis chapter 8, the end of the chapter after the flood, where he says, as long as heaven and earth endure, seed time and harvest, summer and winter, cold and heat will not cease. This is Hebrew poetic structure here called merism, where you take opposite ends of a spectrum and you put them against each other. And the idea is, those and everything in between, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we really have there is a promise from God to himself that as long as the earth endures, he is going to sustain the various cycles of the climate system on which life depends. And so, we've got some biblical input here. You started off asking the question, is this something about which Christians should be concerned? And really the beginning of the answer to that is, well, what is this? When we say climate change, are we actually talking about changes in the climate, or are we talking about a vast political, social movement of concern about changes in climate? Because climate change has sort of come to be used as if it points to that movement. I think we have a lot of reason to be concerned about the movement itself, because it is demanding actions by governments around the world that would severely slow or even stop or reverse the conquest of poverty. And that, I think, is a very bad thing, because poverty is a far greater threat to human well-being, to human life, and so on, than anything related to climate. So we should certainly be concerned about that. I don't think that there's a great reason to be concerned about climate change. because it's actually pretty small on a historical level. We may be back into the same range that we were in the medieval warm period, or the Roman warm period, or the Minoan warm period, or for that matter, the Holocene climate optimum. In all those periods, life flourished better than in the cold periods between them. Warmth is good for life, cold is not.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's part of the grand narrative, I guess, of many of the climate alarmists. You know, we hear Greta Thunberg saying, our house is on fire, we need to act, we need to do something. But the reality is, actually, if you look back at history, you see climates have changed. They've been bad, they've been good. So I guess it's not, as you were saying, it's not about climate change, because climate change is happening. So what would you say is the main motive for people like Greta Thunberg and the people that are promoting her? What do you think this agenda is about for many of the climate activists?
It's very difficult, to plumb the minds of people to get into their motives. Sometimes we have a fair notion based on questions of, cui bono, who profits from this, that, or another policy that people promote. With Greta, my basic thought toward her is that I feel very, very sad for her. I think she's basically being exploited. She certainly does not understand the science of climate change, and instead she is being taken advantage of by people who ought to know better. And someday, probably in another decade or two, she will look back on this period of her life and feel great resentment toward her people, toward her parents, who have been very much involved in this, and toward the various leaders of the climate alarmist movement. I think you have a number of different motives involved. Some people clearly see this as a path toward rejecting free markets, free trade, capitalism, so to speak. And I've written a booklet called "Is Capitalism Bad for the Environment?", which people can order from Cornwall Alliance's online store at cornwallalliance.org. People see this as an excuse to get rid of free markets, free trade, and to replace it with basically a global socialism. Christiana Figueres, the former chairwoman of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is under the United Nations, and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is operating under the FCCC. Figueres said in the lead up to the Paris summit back in 2015, and this is a paraphrase, of course, this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to intentionally change the whole global economic order from what it's been since the Industrial Revolution to something else. Well, she's a socialist. Her father has been a socialist president of Costa Rica, the country from which she hails. It's very clear that that's what she wants. Ottmar Edenhofer, a German economist and former co-chairman of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said in leading up to the Cancun climate summit, you must not make the mistake of thinking that this is an environmental summit. This is an economic summit. And by this, we de facto redistribute the world's wealth from the wealthy West to the poor developing countries. So this is, I think, probably far more the motive than any persuasion by clear scientific evidence. I mean, think for just a second about what it is we're talking about in terms of climate change. The best estimate is that global average surface temperature has risen by approximately 1 degree Celsius since about 1880. Now, there's no way that 1 degree Celsius of increase in global average surface temperature is going to cause catastrophic results. Neither will another degree or 2. This is a tiny fraction of the typical change in temperature between nighttime low and daytime high in any location anywhere on the earth, or certainly between winter low and summer high in any location around the earth. So really, it's irrelevant to human and environmental ecological well-being, other than that, as I said before, warm is good, cold is bad. And then besides that, as we add CO2 to the atmosphere, we're causing all the plants to grow better, because CO2 is essentially fertilizer for plants. They have to have it for photosynthesis. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we were getting low enough in CO2 that we were nearing the boundary at about 170 parts per million, where photosynthesis stops, and therefore all life on Earth will stop. It's good that we've raised it from there, and we would do well to continue raising it.
Yeah, I like that point, because it's a point that's often not made in the media, and many people really don't understand that. If you have warmer climates, it means the poorer people won't suffer in the winter periods. I've noticed very much in the UK over the last number of years, it isn't as colder in December and November as it has been, when I was growing up, and which is a benefit for many elderly people. They don't have to suffer, really harsh temperatures, but you also can produce lots more food with the amount of
much more.
I remember, people might not know this, when the Romans invaded this country, they could grow wine in the north of the United Kingdom.
That's right.
You can't do that today. So there are real benefits. Could you maybe, if you could dig deeper into that, because I think it's an important point that often we miss out on.
Yeah, well, there are all kinds of benefits, both to increased warmth and to increased CO2 in the atmosphere. Back in 2013, I believe it was, Dr. Craig Idso of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, did a review of thousands of different studies over the past roughly 50 years, journal articles, on the impact of increasing CO2 on crop yields around the world. And he tried to sort of summarize these. This was a meta review, so to speak. And he summarized basically by saying, well, from 1960 through 2012, added CO2 in the atmosphere all by itself had increased global crop yields to the tune of $3.2 trillion worth of food that otherwise would not have grown. That's absolutely free to everybody, because nobody pays for the CO2. We pay for the energy we get when we burn fossil fuels, resulting in CO2 going out. But that's not, we're not buying the CO2, we're buying the energy, right? Yeah. So this is really wonderful. I mean, fossil fuel companies should stop apologizing for their products and say instead, look, we produce a product that brings you the energy you need for everything that you do. Now, we charge you a price for that. Thanks very much for buying it. But we also put CO2 into the atmosphere, and we don't charge you a price for that. But all the benefits from that, that's free to you. This is great. So he also was able to calculate, just based on the IPCC's predictions of how much more CO2 we would add to the atmosphere between 2012 and 2050, that another $9.8 trillion worth of free food would be grown just because of the added CO2. So that's a part of the benefit. Another part of the benefit is, as you mentioned, it is getting a bit warmer, not a whole lot, but a little bit. But the alarmists about this will always point to every heat wave and say, that's the new normal, that's what's coming, and any problems you have related to that, those are going to become more common. Well, maybe. What they won't talk about is the fact that as heat waves become more common, cold snaps become less common. And cold snaps, on average, kill 20 times as many people per day as do heat waves. So this is a win-win situation for humanity. Uh, then, of course, you've got all the benefits that you get from the energy itself. Everything we do requires that energy. And this energy has been absolutely indispensable to lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty all through history. I mean, if we look back at human welfare through the centuries, through the millennia, uh, once you get past the early post-creation period of very long lifetimes, I think caused by the fact that there hadn't been much genetic decay happening yet. Once you get past there, for all human history, everywhere in the world, average human life expectancy at birth was about 27 years. Infant and child mortality rate, that is death by age 5, before the 5th birthday, was about 50%. Today, average human life expectancy around the world is right around about 70 years. In the highly developed countries, it's about 80 years, and it's still going up. And infant and child mortality rates in developed countries are way below 0.1%, and in developing countries, they tend to be down around 2 or 3%. This is good news, and it's because of all the tremendous things in agriculture, in medicine, in transportation, etc., that we can do because of abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And the climate alarmist movement is asking us to reject that and embrace instead wind and solar as the primary versions of so-called renewable energy, which are highly intermittent and therefore cannot power a reliable electric grid. And therefore, we're going to cast people back into the kind of poverty that you have when you don't have abundant, affordable, reliable energy.
Yeah, very much so. Something I've noticed, Dr. Beisner, when I are looking at this issue of climate change and seeing what people are saying, is that although we live in the secular West, and the secular West is not meant to be religious, when you listen to many of the activists, they're talking about saving the planet. I was watching the COP26 conference in Scotland,
Yes.
and I noticed that a number of the young people there had built booths where you could go and confess your climate sins. And I thought, that's interesting. Who are they confessing their sins to? Because surely they don't believe in God, and do they believe the planet's alive? But do you think they've taken on a religious aspect to this? Is it sort of pantheistic?
Yeah, most of the environmental movement over the past roughly 60 years, since it became distinct from the conservationist movement, has been rooted in either a naturalistic, materialistic worldview where matter and energy is all that is, or a pantheistic, panentheistic, or animistic worldview. Pantheism, God is everything. Theism, God inhabits the universe as the soul inhabits the body. Animism, rather, various gods inhabit rocks and trees and streams and things like that, right? Either one of these denies the creator-creature distinction that is central to the Christian worldview. And when you do that, the secularists think that they are not religious. No, man is inherently religious, and we will always worship whatever it is that we think is the ultimate.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them, matter and energy is ultimate, so we wind up worshiping the creation. For the pantheists, panentheists, and animists, spiritists, they equate the God or gods with the natural world, and so they too wind up worshiping the natural world. Well, Scripture tells us in Romans chapter 1 very, very clearly what happens when you do that. When you reject the Creator and you begin to worship the creation instead of the Creator, then God gives you over to a depraved mind. Confessing yourself to be wise, you become a fool, and you worship created things instead of the Creator. Well, I think really we see this working out in a great deal of the environmental movement, and if anything, we see it working out almost best in the climate alarmist movement, because there is so much just plain silliness involved in a lot of it. I mean, if you look carefully at a lot of the scientific claims and think about them hard, or pseudoscientific claims, for instance, the notion the planet is burning, right? Now, what is the temperature at which most wood uh, begins to combust, to burn? Well, it's well over 500 degrees Fahrenheit. As an American, sorry, I think in Fahrenheit. It's well over 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Global average temperature might rise by 1.8 degree Fahrenheit over the last 150 years or so. Who in the world thinks that's going to ignite fire?
Mm.
And yet we get these crazy sayings coming out as if they were science. That's just not rational.
Yeah, so we can definitely see sort of a religious aspect then involved in this movement. But that's interesting because you opened up talking about your time in India and the destruction really that their worldview brings on themselves. But
Yeah.
when you think about pantheism and monism, that they're Eastern religions, and
Yes.
so if people are trying to go that way in their thinking, then it's only going to be disastrous for us.
Oh, absolutely. We have to remember that when God created the world, He created all these different life forms, and they're wonderful. Praise the Lord for all of them, and it's fascinating to study them. But He made a very big difference between them and us. Only when it came to making human beings do we have Him saying, "Let us make in our image and after our likeness." Only human beings bear the image of God. When we lose that distinction between human beings and the rest of the world, we dehumanize humans. The animal rights movement, for example, right, um, tends to equate human life with animal life. And so they'll say, for example, we want to have a humane ethic toward the beasts, right? Toward all the different animals that are around us. Well, if human beings are not really different in principle from the beasts, then a humane ethic toward the beasts means the same thing as a beastly ethic toward humans. So what surprise is it that we abort millions and millions of human beings before they get born from their mother's wombs? What surprise is it if now we're doing organ harvesting in China, and recently there have been allegations that it's going on in American hospitals? Uh, you know, if people are no more than a little bit more advanced organisms than porpoises and dogs and pigs and amoebas, why do we need to treat them any differently?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Another thing I wanted to talk about, you sort of mentioned it there when you talked about abortion, is when I was looking at COP26 last year. It was in November, held in
Hmm.
Scotland. For people who don't know, it was a climate conference held by the United Nations. But on the final day, there were a number of things going on, and I noticed there was a charity from the UK there, and they had an inflatable giant baby, and on the baby it had "Smaller Family, Cooler Planet," and it was
Yeah.
basically advocating, there are way too many people on the planet. Um, I've got 7 children. I know you've got a few.
Oh my.
Yeah, yeah. And so we obviously believe in in God's blessing upon on the family, but there's a worldview difference in people saying, look, actually too many people, were overpopulated. That's
Yeah.
what we hear, but is that the truth? Could you touch on
Yeah.
that?
Oh, absolutely not. I've addressed all of this in great detail in my book, Prospects for Growth, A Biblical View of Population Resources in the Future, which also is available at cornwallalliance.org/shop.
Yeah, great.
And the answer is no, the world is not overpopulated. One way to address this is to look at measures of scarcity of people versus other things, okay? And this is going to sound a little weird for a moment, but economists tell us that there's really only one way to measure changes in scarcity, and that's by looking at changes in price, because price is a measure of scarcity. The more scarce something is, the higher its price will be. The less scarce, the lower its price. Now, it's important that we understand that scarcity is not an absolute measure. It's not a question of how much total is there of this in the universe. Scarcity is a relative measure, namely, how much of this is available at such and such a price compared with how much is requested, demanded at that price. Now, every resource that we extract from the earth, whether it's minerals, whether it's vegetables, whether it's animals, and all of those things we extract from the earth, every resource that we extract from the earth, the long-term price trend of it is sharply down. Around the world, most minerals since, say, 1800 have fallen by over 99% in inflation-adjusted price. And then when you add also adjusting for wages, that is, how many hours of work does it take to acquire this much copper or this much coal or whatever, right? When you adjust for wages, the decline is even greater. So what that means is every resource that we extract from the earth is getting less scarce over time. Now, when people say that the earth is overpopulated, what they have in mind is, oh, we're using up all the world's resources. Well, if we're using them up, they should be becoming more scarce, not less, over time. But the opposite is what's happening. Now, there is one thing that's going the opposite direction, that's getting more scarce over time, not less. And surprisingly enough, it's people. And we know that because the inflation of adjusted value of wages has been rising over time. Why is this? It's because people made in the image of God with rational minds like his mind, designed to understand and manipulate the world as he designed it to be understood and manipulated, make resources. And the more of us there are, the more resources we make. We're made in God's image to be creative and productive as he is. Most of the environmental movement looks at people as simply consumers and polluters. The Bible recognizes that God made us to be producers and stewards. So are we running out of resources? No. Are we polluting the planet to death? No. As a matter of fact, as societies grow richer, they can afford the expensive technologies necessary to reduce pollution emissions from the very industrial occupations that make them richer. This is called the environmental transition. Won't go into that. But no, we're not overpopulated. We are instead, we're told by the Lord to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over everything in it. And this is what we ought to be doing.
Yeah. And children are a blessing from the Lord.
Yes, right. I mean, Psalm 127 does not say children are a curse from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his punishment. Sad is the man whose quiver is full of them.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I can hear a lot of my children upstairs at the moment, and I'm really glad I've got them. I'm blessed. I'm sure you're blessed by your children who are probably grown up now. And yeah, what a blessing children
And
are.
and our 14 grandchildren,
Yeah,
one of whom with his mother, and or two of whom with their mother and their father, live in the UK there,
yeah, I remember. Yeah, they live in Durham, I think that is, isn't it? Northeast.
near it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, we've talked about a number of things tonight, Dr. Beisner, but maybe we could, just before we bring everything to a close, talk about how we relate this to a church. Do you have struggles as a ministry in trying to get the church to see the importance of being a biblical steward of creation, helping them see why this issue is important?
Yeah, it is a struggle for, I think, several different reasons. Um, One is that so many churches are afraid to become politically engaged, and a great deal of environmental movement and environmental policy is actually, very politically relevant. And so when you have that fear, churches want to just pull back and say, "Oh no, it's just about uh, you know giving people the gospel and making sure that they go to heaven instead of to hell." Well, the gospel is absolutely the greatest treasure that the church has. I've dedicated my life to it since long before I began serving these particular issues, um, and yet it's not all, because Jesus tells us that we're supposed to make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey all things that I have commanded you. Well, the scriptures, they address all kinds of matters about our civil and civic engagement. They address matters of law. They address matters of policy. There are implications from the scriptures for these things. And if we are not addressing these things, we are not teaching the whole counsel of God from the whole word of God for the whole people of God for the whole of life. This is what we should be doing. Another issue is that so many churches have recognized rightly that much of the environmentalist movement has indeed been either secularist, materialist, or Eastern pantheist.
Hmm.
And therefore, they think, oh, environmentalism automatically is going to lead to false religious thinking. Well, environmentalism perhaps, but the stewardship of creation, the exercise of godly dominion over this earth that God gave us in Genesis 1:28,
Yeah.
uh, that doesn't have to be false religion. And then I think there may be uh, one other, well, two other contributors to this. One is a growing movement, at least in the American church community, that is referred to as neo two kingdoms theology,
Yeah.
which says, the church job is only to address spiritual issues, of course, defining spiritual very, very narrowly, not these others. And to address these others is to jeopardize the spirituality of the pastoral call or of the church's call. That I think is very sad, because it keeps us from being salt and light to a decaying and dark world. The other one is, frankly, that so much pastoral education, seminary education, is extremely narrow. Very, very few pastors have ever studied much in the way of economics or the history of political thought or science and so on. And so they, I think, understandably, feel themselves to be not qualified to address those issues. Well, that may be, but what they need to do then is to find people who are qualified, who do have the appropriate educational background, and who have a commitment to the authority of Scripture, to the service of Christ, and say, okay, come and help me to teach my people about this.
Yeah. And if folks are watching from North America, US, Canada, I could highly recommend Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Get Dr. Calvin Beisner to come speak at your church, maybe do a conference. This is such an important issue. And we've heard so much tonight about Genesis 1 and just how important that is to a biblical worldview. And maybe we could just bring this to a close. I know there was something your ministry sent out maybe a week or two ago about some of the consequences we see if you speak out on climate changes. That was the deplatforming of Dr. Roy Spencer. Now, you mentioned Dr. Roy Spencer already. Could you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, actually, it wasn't deplatforming, it was demonetizing,
That's it.
which is not the same thing as demonizing, although it may be closely related. Dr. Spencer has a website, drroyspencer.com, drroyspencer.com. Very, very good. It's extremely educational. And through it, like so many other people who have websites, he sells the books that he's written. He gets a very, very small amount of income from that. He mentioned in his report about this demonetization that it just doesn't really make a significant difference in his income. But what has happened is that Google has determined that because of Dr. Spencer's views about climate change, they are not going to service the aspects of his website that enable people to buy product. They're not allowing search engines to lead people there through certain kinds of questions. It's part of cancel culture to do this sort of thing. And what's really ironic about it is that actually Spencer is probably pretty close to being middle of the road on climate change. He thinks that human activity has contributed very significantly to the warming of the last 100 years or so, primarily the last 50 years. He thinks that we are continuing to contribute to that. He thinks that there are some problems that come from that, as well as some benefits that come from that. He would fall within the so-called 97% of all climate scientists that people refer to all the time. He would fall right smack in the middle with that. And yet, because he has the temerity to challenge the notion that human-induced climate change is an existential threat, Google wants to, demonetize him.
Yeah. Well, we could pray for people like Dr. Roy Spencer, like yourself, who are taking a stand on these issues. Folks, I would encourage you to visit Dr. Beisner's website. If people want to get in contact with you, Dr. Beisner, how do they do that? What website should they visit? Facebook and etc.
Yeah, right. CornwallAlliance.org, where they can sign up for our 2 or 3 times a week email newsletter that comes out. They can write to us at stewards@cornwallalliance.org. We have a Facebook page, Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and we have a YouTube channel, Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Every Tuesday evening, America time, unfortunately that makes it pretty late for UK time, but we do a live stream on both Facebook and YouTube, and those stay up permanently after that, so people can view those. We have a variety of different specialists on, and we have conversations like this one, except that I bring experts who know the stuff a whole lot better than I do. And, so it makes for a lot of fun.
Yeah, I stayed up during lockdown and listened to some of those live ones. So yeah, I can recommend them to people. Very edifying, very helpful when it comes to these issues that we're facing today. And so, Dr. Beisner, I want to thank you for your time this evening. It's been a great privilege to speak to you.
Simon, thank you very much. It's been my privilege, and may the Lord bless you and your whole ministry there in the UK, as well as AIG here in the United States. Y'all are good friends.
Thank you. And just to those watching still tonight, I would highly recommend the booklet I mentioned at the beginning, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice. I do have a copy of the book Prospects of Growth, but it's not in this room at the moment. I forgot to get that. I can highly recommend that. So please do go out and check some of those books on Dr. Beisner's website. And with that, I'm going to end everything and wish you a good evening or a good morning or a good day, wherever you are watching it in the world. And may you be blessed.